On the 29th of May, 1453, a 19-year-old sultan stood before walls that had turned back every army for 1100 years, and by nightfall, an empire that began with Augustus himself would cease to exist. Somewhere inside those walls, a door that should have been locked was standing open. This is the story of how one of the most fortified cities ever built finally fell, and why almost no one on either side of the walls believed it was possible until it actually happened. To understand what fell on that spring morning, you first have to understand what the city actually was. Constantinople was not just another medieval capital. It was, according to most historians, the last living fragment of the Roman Empire, a state that had endured in some form since the days of Augustus, nearly 15 centuries earlier. By the 15th century, the empire itself had shrunk to almost nothing. A capital city, a scattering of Aegean islands, a strip of land in the Peloponnese. And yet the walls around that capital still made the city feel, to outsiders, like something eternal. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century under the emperor, whose name they carried, ran for roughly 4 miles along the landward side of the city, layered in a triple line of defenses, a wide moat that could be flooded, an outer wall studded with towers, and behind it, an inner wall that in places rose over 30 feet high and was thick enough for soldiers to walk along its top. No army in history had broken through those land walls by force. Crusaders had taken the city once, in 1204, but only through betrayal and a naval assault against the weaker sea walls, not by storming the great landward defenses. The scale of the fortifications is worth pausing on, because it explains why so many previous attackers had simply given up rather than risk a direct assault. The outer wall alone stood studded with dozens of towers spaced at regular intervals, each one capable of independent defense even if a neighboring section came under pressure, while the deep moat in front of it could be flooded through a system of sluices to slow any approach to a crawl under direct fire from above. Behind that outer line rose the inner wall, thicker still, tall enough that defenders standing on its parapets could fire down over the heads of their own troops manning the outer defenses. This layered design meant that an attacking force had to fight its way across open, exposed ground, through a flooded ditch, over or through one wall, across a killing ground in between, and then through a second wall entirely, all while under fire from multiple directions at once. It had worked, essentially unbroken in its core design, since the 5th century. Everyone who studied siege warfare in the 15th century knew this history, and that knowledge is exactly what made what happened next so unthinkable to the people living through it. Constantine himself had not always expected to wear the crown he now carried through this crisis. Born the 4th surviving son of a previous emperor, he had spent much of his earlier adult life not in the capital, but governing the Byzantine territories in the Peloponnese, a role in which, according to most historical accounts, he earned a genuine reputation as a capable and energetic administrator and military commander, defending and even briefly expanding the last significant Byzantine holdings outside the capital itself. He came to the imperial throne in 1449, only after the deaths of 2 older brothers left the succession to him, arriving in Constantinople as a seasoned provincial ruler rather than a court insider, a background that may help explain both his hands-on approach to the city's final defense and the genuine respect he seems to have earned from soldiers like Giustiniani, who were not naturally inclined to serve foreign monarchs with blind loyalty. By the year 1451, the Byzantine Empire was Rome in name only. Its emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, ruled over a capital surrounded on almost every side by Ottoman territory. The empire he inherited controlled little beyond the city walls themselves, a few outlying towns, and the distant despotate his brothers governed in the Peloponnese. He had come to power without even a formal coronation in Constantinople's cathedral, crowned instead in the provincial town of Mistras, because the political and religious situation in the capital was too fragile for a full imperial ceremony. He was, by most accounts, a competent and personally brave ruler, a soldier emperor in a dynasty that had produced few of them in its final century of infighting and civil war. But competence alone was never going to be enough. He inherited a treasury that could barely pay its own soldiers, and a population that had fallen from hundreds of thousands at the city's height to somewhere around 50,000 people, according to most historical estimates, rattling around inside walls originally built for a city many times that size. Entire neighborhoods within those walls had become farmland, orchards, and empty ruins, dotted between a handful of still thriving districts near the harbor. This was not a great power bracing for a fight. This was a shrinking, half-empty city, waiting to see how long its ancient stones could hold. It had not always looked this fragile. Twice before, in living memory of the older generation, Ottoman armies had appeared outside these very walls and failed to take them. Once during a long blockade at the turn of the century, broken only when a Mongol invasion under Timur forced the Ottomans to withdraw and fight for their own survival farther east, and again in 1422, when Sultan Murad II, father of the man who would finally succeed, launched a determined assault and was repelled with heavy losses. Both times the city had survived less through its own strength than through outside crisis and outright luck. Constantine's court understood this history intimately. They had watched the empire survive by the width of a knife's edge before. What they could not have known was that the next attempt would come from a very different kind of opponent, younger, more patient, and far better prepared than either of his predecessors had been. The danger closing in from outside the walls was only half the story. Inside them, the city was also quietly divided against itself, and that division would matter more than most people at the time wanted to admit. The push for church union with Rome, desperate as it was as a strategy for securing Western military help, split the Byzantine elite into bitter factions. Some, led by clergy who saw doctrinal submission to the Pope as a betrayal of 13 centuries of Orthodox tradition, argued that even conquest by the Ottomans, who at least tolerated Orthodox worship, would be preferable to religious surrender to Rome. A phrase along those lines is often attributed to the Megas Du Lucas Notaras, one of the empire's most powerful nobles, though historians caution that the exact wording attributed to him may have been sharpened or invented by later writers, even if it captured a real and widespread sentiment inside the city at the time. Notaras himself would go on to serve loyally and die within days of the city's fall, regardless of these tensions, a reminder that the political divisions inside Constantinople were genuine, but rarely as simple as outright treachery. This internal strain shaped the siege in quieter ways throughout its 2 months. Some historians argue that lingering resentment over the Union, and lingering distrust between Greek citizens and the Genoese and Venetian merchant communities living inside the walls, occasionally slowed coordination between different defensive sectors, even as most individual soldiers and commanders, regardless of faction, fought with genuine desperation once the bombardment began. It is a detail worth holding on to, because it complicates the simpler version of this story, the one where a united city falls purely to superior force. The truth most historians now emphasize is messier and more human, a city that fought bravely despite its divisions, not because it had somehow set them all aside. Mehmed II became Ottoman Sultan in February of 1451, following the death of his father, Murad II. He had actually held the throne briefly once before, as a boy of 12, placed there while his father retired from public life, and had been pushed aside within 2 years by his father's own advisors, who did not trust a child to manage a dangerously unstable peace with the Byzantines and the Balkan states. That early humiliation, historians generally agree, shaped the man he became. When Mehmed returned to the throne for good, in his late teens, foreign courts across Europe largely dismissed him as untested and unthreatening, a young ruler who could probably be managed the way his father had been. It was, according to most accounts, exactly the assumption Mehmed wanted them to make. Almost immediately, his attention turned to the one prize that generations of Muslim rulers before him had tried and failed to take. There was, by this point, a long tradition, going back centuries, referenced even in early Islamic tradition, of Constantinople as the ultimate unconquered city, the target that would bring immense religious and political glory to whichever commander finally took it. Mehmed did not hide his ambition from those closest to him. According to court chroniclers, writing after the fact, he studied the failed sieges of the past with unusual intensity for a man his age, reportedly poring over maps and accounts of earlier campaigns, looking specifically for what previous armies had gotten wrong. What he concluded, according to most historical accounts, was that earlier attempts had failed for two connected reasons. First, no army had ever managed to fully cut the city off, because the Byzantines could always resupply and reinforce by sea, using naval superiority that the Ottomans, still primarily a land power, had never matched. Second, no army had brought artillery powerful enough to break stone walls that thick and that deep. Mehmed set out, with a patience that surprised even his own advisors, to solve both problems before he ever brought a single soldier near the city walls themselves. Part of what made Mehmed such an unusual opponent was the education that had shaped him long before he ever took the throne for good. Ottoman court tutors had reportedly drilled him in multiple languages, including Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Persian, alongside his native Turkish, and in mathematics, history, and military engineering, giving him a breadth of technical and cultural literacy unusual even among royal heirs of the period. According to most accounts, he took a particular personal interest in classical history and in the achievements of ancient conquerors, reportedly studying accounts of Alexander the Great and earlier sieges of the city with real intensity. This was not, in other words, a young ruler relying purely on inherited armies and generals to do his thinking for him. He appears, from the available record, to have taken direct personal ownership of the strategic and engineering problems the siege presented, down to reportedly sketching or closely directing the placement of individual gun batteries himself. Why would a teenage sultan, barely secure on his own throne, gamble everything on a siege that had broken two of his predecessors already? The first move came in the summer of 1452, and it was less a battle than a piece of engineering aimed directly at that first weakness. On the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait, at its narrowest point just north of the city, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive new fortress. It went up astonishingly fast. Historians estimate a matter of months, using thousands of laborers conscripted from across Ottoman territory, working in shifts around the clock. It was called Rumeli Hizari, the throat cutter, and paired with an older Ottoman fortress already standing on the opposite Asian shore, it gave Mehmed complete control over the narrowest stretch of water leading south into the Bosphorus and on toward Constantinople. Any ship, Byzantine, Venetian, Genoese, or otherwise, now had to pass directly beneath Ottoman cannon fire to reach the city from the north. When a Venetian trading vessel attempted to run that gauntlet without stopping later that year, historical accounts describe it being sunk on the spot and its surviving crew subsequently executed. The message could not have been clearer to every merchant power with ships in those waters. The sea approach the city had always quietly relied on for supply, and reinforcement was no longer safe to assume. The second problem, the walls themselves, needed a very different kind of solution, and it came, somewhat ironically, from a man who had first tried to sell his services to the other side. A Hungarian engineer and cannon founder named Orban had reportedly approached the Byzantine emperor first, offering to build siege artillery, but Constantine's government could not afford to pay what the work required. Orban then turned to Mehmed instead, and found a patron with far deeper resources and far greater ambition for exactly what Orban could build. Working through the winter of 1452 into 1453, Orban's foundries produced a series of massive bronze cannons, culminating in one gun so enormous that historical accounts describe it needing dozens of oxen and hundreds of men simply to haul it into position, firing stone balls that some sources describe as weighing over half a ton apiece. Whether every specific figure in these accounts is fully precise is genuinely debated among historians, since medieval chroniclers on all sides were prone to dramatic rounding. But the core fact is not in dispute. The Ottomans now possessed siege artillery on a scale that had simply never been brought against these particular walls before, and Orban's guns took weeks just to transport from the foundry to the city, dragged along specially built roads by teams of oxen numbering, according to some accounts, in the hundreds for the largest piece alone. The largest of Orban's guns deserves a closer look, because its sheer scale is part of what made this siege feel, to contemporaries, like the arrival of a genuinely new kind of warfare. Historical accounts describe its barrel as roughly 26 feet in length, cast in bronze, capable of hurling a stone projectile that some sources place at around half a ton in weight, over a distance of more than a mile. It reportedly required a specially reinforced wooden carriage and dozens of yoked oxen simply to move short distances, and its rate of fire was consequently glacial by later standards, some accounts suggesting it could only be loaded, aimed, and fired a handful of times across an entire day, with the barrel needing time to cool between shots to avoid cracking under its own heat. It was, in other words, not a weapon of speed or precision, but of raw, unprecedented psychological and physical shock, capable of doing in a single strike what earlier siege weapons might have taken days of steady effort to accomplish against the same stretch of wall. Alongside this single giant, Orban's foundries produced a range of smaller, more numerous cannons that could be fired far more frequently, and it was this combination, occasional devastating blows from the giant gun paired with sustained harassing fire from the smaller battery pieces, that defined the character of the bombardment across the 2 months that followed. By the winter of 1452, word of these preparations had reached Constantine inside the city, and a controlled but very real panic began spreading through the imperial court. He sent envoys pleading for help across Christian Europe, to the Pope in Rome, to the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, to the kingdoms of Hungary and Aragon, to anyone who might see the danger clearly enough to act. And here the story takes on another layer of tragedy, because most of that promised help never came at all, or came far too late, or arrived burdened with conditions the Byzantines found almost impossible to accept. One more player in this drama deserves attention, precisely because of how carefully it tried to avoid taking a side at all. Directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople stood Galata, a fortified trading colony controlled by the Genoese Republic, populated by merchants who had built prosperous lives on commerce with both the Byzantines and the Ottomans alike. Throughout the build-up to the siege, and through the siege itself, the official government of Galata maintained a policy of strict neutrality, unwilling to risk its valuable trading privileges by openly siding with the Byzantines against a sultan who could, if angered enough, crush the colony as easily as he intended to crush the city across the water. In practice, this neutrality was porous. Individual Genoese citizens, including Giustiniani himself and his several hundred men, crossed over to fight for Constantinople as private volunteers rather than official state forces, a legal fiction that allowed Genoa's formal government to maintain deniability, while some of its most capable soldiers fought and died defending the neighboring city anyway. It was, in its own quiet way, one more example of how this siege was never simply a clean contest between two unified sides, but a tangled situation full of divided loyalties, private initiative, and governments calculating their own survival right up until the final morning. So why, with the most capable sultan in a generation building cannons the size of houses on their doorstep, did the great powers of Christian Europe largely look the other way? The uncomfortable answer historians point to is a rift nearly 4 centuries old. The Christian Church had formally split between Rome and Constantinople back in the 11th century, and that division had only deepened after the Fourth Crusade sacked the city itself in 1204, a wound that, according to most accounts, had genuinely never healed in the minds of ordinary Greeks. Many in the West saw the Greek East not as a fellow Christian civilization in mortal danger, but as a stubborn, doctrinally suspect rival that had, in their view, brought this fate upon itself through centuries of resistance to Roman religious authority. Pope Nicholas V did offer to help, but attached a heavy condition, formal union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, with Constantinople submitting to Rome's authority, a demand deeply unpopular with much of the Byzantine clergy and public. A union was in fact solemnly proclaimed inside the city's great cathedral in December of 1452, but according to most historical accounts, it was met by large portions of the population with open hostility rather than gratitude, and it produced remarkably little in the way of the large Western army the city actually needed to survive. What did arrive, instead of armies, were smaller, braver individual commitments. A Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo sailed into the city with several hundred well-trained men and considerable resources of his own, and Constantine reportedly placed him in overall command of the crucial land walls almost immediately, recognizing genuine military skill when he finally saw it after months of disappointment. Venice, which held major trading interests and an entire resident merchant colony inside the city, eventually voted to send a relief fleet, But crucially, that vote came only after the siege had already begun, and the ships that were eventually dispatched would not reach the Bosphorus until it was already far too late to matter. When the final tally was made, the total defenders of Constantinople numbered somewhere around 7,000 or 8,000 men, according to most modern historical estimates, against an Ottoman force that historians place at somewhere between 60 and 80,000, though contemporary chronicles on both sides inflated their own numbers considerably for dramatic and propagandistic effect, and precise figures remain genuinely disputed to this day. What is not disputed is the scale of the imbalance itself. The defenders were outnumbered by something close to 10 to 1, spread thin across 4 miles of ancient wall that a city of only 50,000 people could barely staff even in peacetime, let alone under sustained bombardment. And so, in the first days of April 1453, the Ottoman army began appearing on the ridgelines outside those walls, and the siege that would end an empire had begun. The land army first appeared before the Theodosian walls around the 2nd of April, moving into position over several days as Mehmed's engineers scouted the ground and chose firing positions for the great guns still being hauled up from the rear. Within roughly a week, the massive cannons had been wheeled into place, and the bombardment began in earnest. The sound alone, according to eyewitness accounts recorded from inside the city, was something people had genuinely never experienced before. A physical shock that could reportedly be felt through the ground even from a considerable distance, followed instantly by the crash and shudder of ancient stone absorbing a direct hit for the first time in its 1100-year history. Some accounts describe pregnant women inside the city, miscarrying from the sheer concussive force of the largest gun's discharge, a detail impossible to verify with certainty, but repeated across enough independent sources that most historians take it seriously as a reflection of just how unprecedented and disorienting the bombardment felt to those living through it. But the defenders quickly discovered something important, something that would define the entire character of the siege for weeks to come. The walls, ancient as they were, had one advantage the Ottoman gunners had not fully accounted for in their planning. Byzantine work crews, laboring through the nights under Justiniani's direct supervision, repaired breaches almost as fast as the cannons could open them, packing gaps with timber frames, loose rubble, and earth-filled barrels and wool bales that actually absorbed the shock of a cannonball far better than solid, brittle stone ever could. Day after day, for weeks on end, the same exhausting pattern repeated itself. The guns would open a gap in the wall by evening. By morning, exhausted defenders had patched it closed again, ready to withstand the next day's bombardment. It was brutal, unglamorous, back-breaking work, carried out in darkness under constant threat of further fire. And it meant that, for the early weeks of the siege, the single greatest technological advantage the Ottomans possessed was being quietly, stubbornly neutralized by nothing more than sheer human endurance and discipline. Meanwhile, the sea told a very different story, and one where, for a time, the defenders actually held the advantage. The entrance to the Golden Horn, the long, sheltered inlet running alongside the city's northern flank, had for centuries been protected by an enormous iron chain, stretched across the water's narrow mouth between a tower inside the city and the fortified Genoese settlement of Galata, directly across the inlet. As long as that chain held firm, Ottoman ships could not sail into the harbor to strike at the city's weaker sea walls directly, and the Christian ships sheltering inside the Horn remained safe from naval assault. In the 3rd week of April, Ottoman naval commanders tried to force the issue anyway, launching an attack meant to break through or bypass the chain. Christian vessels inside the harbor, fewer in number but according to most accounts far more skillfully handled in close combat, fought them off in a sharp and costly engagement that Mehmed reportedly watched in person from the shore, and which, by some accounts, left him furious enough afterward to personally strip his fleet's commander of rank and have him beaten for the failure. That naval failure seems to have convinced Mehmed that the chain and the sea walls together made any further direct assault by water pointless, at least along the route everyone expected. So instead, he turned to a solution so audacious that when it finally happened, it stunned the defenders completely, and has been retold ever since as one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the entire campaign. But before that solution arrived, the defenders had one shining afternoon of hope, and it came from the sea as well. On the 20th of April, Lookouts along the walls spotted sails on the horizon. A small relief convoy of 4 ships, 3 Genoese vessels loaded with soldiers and supplies, sailing alongside a large Byzantine grain ship, all of them attempting to run directly through the Ottoman naval blockade to reach the safety of the Golden Horn. Mehmed's fleet, vastly more numerous, moved to intercept them just off the coast, and what followed was watched, according to most historical accounts, by both entire armies at once, Ottoman soldiers crowding the shore, and Byzantine defenders crowding the sea walls and rooftops of the city, straining to see the outcome of single naval engagement that felt, in that moment, like it might decide everything. The 4 Christian ships, taller and more heavily built than the smaller Ottoman galleys surrounding them, fought their way through the encirclement in a desperate, hours-long battle, using their height advantage to rain down missiles onto the smaller vessels attempting to grapple and board them. By evening, helped by a shift in the wind, all 4 ships broke free of the blockade and reached the safety of the chain, to the open jubilation of the watching defenders. For Mehmed, watching from the shore, the failure was humiliating precisely because it was so public, and precisely because it demonstrated to his own army and to the watching world that Ottoman naval power still had real limits. It was this humiliation, several historians argue, that hardened his resolve to solve the naval problem permanently, and set in motion the extraordinary overland portage of his fleet that would follow just 2 days later. The bombardment above ground was only one half of the siege. Beneath the surface, a quieter and less well-known struggle was unfolding at the same time, and it very nearly succeeded where the cannons failed. Ottoman engineers, many of them experienced miners drawn from Serbian territories under Ottoman control, began digging tunnels beneath sections of the wall, intending either to collapse the foundations directly or to break through into the city unseen. Byzantine defenses against this threat rested heavily on the skill of a single foreign engineer, a Scottish or German soldier named Johannes Grant, according to most accounts a genuine expert in the specialized craft of detecting and countering enemy tunnels, using techniques that reportedly included setting out vibration-sensitive containers of water to detect distant digging. Grant and his crews located tunnel after tunnel throughout May, breaking into them from countermines of their own, and destroying the Ottoman diggers inside with fire, flooding, or direct hand-to-hand fighting in cramped underground passages. By most accounts, every significant mining attempt across the siege was ultimately discovered and neutralized before it could be completed. A quiet but genuinely important defensive success that received far less attention afterward than the dramatic events above ground, but which may have closed off what could otherwise have been the single fastest route into the city. Alongside the mining struggle, the Ottomans also launched at least one major assault well before the final attack, a large-scale attempt on the 7th of May against a damaged stretch of the Mesotichon, the section of wall running through a slight valley in the terrain that was considered the most vulnerable point along the entire 4-mile perimeter, precisely because the ground there dipped low enough to expose the walls more directly to bombardment. That assault, like the naval attempts before it, was beaten back at heavy cost to the attackers, and defenders reportedly credited a mix of desperate close-quarters fighting and, once again, Giustiniani's steady command of that critical sector. Each failed assault bought the city more time, but each one also drained further reserves of energy and manpower that the defenders, unlike the far larger Ottoman army, had no real way to replace. Away from the fighting on the ramparts, an entire city was still trying to function under bombardment, and the accounts that survive from inside those weeks describe something closer to grinding exhaustion than constant panic. Church bells, according to several sources, were rung continuously during moments of greatest danger, not so much to warn of specific attacks as to summon every able-bodied man, monk, and even armed civilian to whichever section of wall was under the heaviest pressure at that hour. Women and children reportedly worked through the nights alongside soldiers, hauling stone, water, and repair materials up to the walls, since the garrison was simply too small to spare fighting men for that labor. Food stores, never abundant in a city that had shrunk so dramatically from its former size, grew shorter as the siege wore into its second month, and merchants inside the city, according to some accounts, faced growing anger over prices that climbed as supplies dwindled. Sleep became a genuine scarcity for the defenders manning the walls, most of whom were rotating through shifts with barely any rest between one day's repair work and the next day's renewed bombardment. By the final week of May, according to most accounts, both the soldiers on the walls and the Sultan's own troops in their siege camps were operating on the ragged edge of physical exhaustion, a detail that matters, because it means the battle's final outcome was decided as much by which side had anything left to give in its last reserves, as by any single tactical decision either commander made. Here is the detail that changes how you have to think about everything that came before it. Mehmed did not go around the chain. He went around the water itself. Sometime around the 22nd of April, under cover of darkness, Ottoman engineers began hauling an entire fleet of ships. Historians estimate somewhere around 70 vessels, though exact numbers vary meaningfully by source, overland, on greased wooden tracks laid across the hills behind the Genoese settlement of Galata, bypassing the chain entirely, and lowering the ships back into the water directly inside the Golden Horn itself. By morning, the defenders of Constantinople woke to find an entire Ottoman fleet floating calmly inside the very harbor they had believed was sealed shut, a sight so disorienting and strange that some chroniclers describe it feeling less like a rational military maneuver and more like an omen sent against them. The psychological impact, most historians agree, may have mattered every bit as much as the tactical one. Suddenly the defenders had to man and defend an entirely new stretch of seawall along the Golden Horn that had never expected serious attack, stretching an already dangerously thin garrison even further across the city's perimeter. From that point forward, the defenders of Constantinople were fighting a siege on effectively two separate fronts, with a total force that had already been far too small for just one. And still, remarkably, against every expectation, the great land walls held. Weeks passed. May arrived, bringing with it rising heat, dwindling food stores, and an exhaustion inside the city that no amount of determination could fully hold at bay. Mehmed's own war council, according to several surviving accounts, grew genuinely divided during this stretch. Some senior advisors reportedly urged him to consider lifting the siege if a decisive breakthrough didn't come soon, worried about the approach of a Western relief force that, unknown to them at the time, was never actually going to arrive in any meaningful strength. Mehmed refused to abandon a siege that had already consumed so much of his young reign's ambition, treasury, and personal credibility. Instead, in the final days of May, he ordered one last overwhelming assault, choosing a night that would, in hindsight, mark the final hours of a Roman Empire that had endured for nearly 1,500 years. In the last week of May, as exhaustion deepened on both sides of the wall, several documented events took place inside the city that, regardless of what anyone today makes of them, profoundly affected morale at the time, and are recorded independently by more than one eyewitness chronicler. On the 22nd of May, a lunar eclipse darkened the sky over the city, and according to most accounts, it struck many inside the walls as the fulfillment of an old prophecy, repeated for generations, that the city could never fall while the moon was full and shining. Days later, during a religious procession carrying one of the city's most venerated icons of the Virgin Mary through the streets to bolster public morale, the icon reportedly slipped from its platform and fell to the ground, an accident that several chroniclers describe as deeply unsettling to those who witnessed it. That same afternoon, according to these accounts, a sudden and unusually thick fog rolled in over the city, followed that evening by an odd, unexplained glow reported around the dome of Hagia Sophia itself. Modern historians generally treat these episodes as a mixture of genuine unusual weather, ordinary accidents, and later retelling shaped by hindsight and religious meaning, rather than anything supernatural. But they matter to the story regardless, because they tell us how the people actually living through those final days interpreted what was happening to them. By the last night before the final assault, significant parts of the city's population reportedly believed, independent of anything happening on the battlefield itself, that they were watching the end of something ordained rather than merely the outcome of cannon fire and troop numbers. The final assault began in the darkest hours of the 29th of May, 1453. Though the exhausted city had already spent the entire preceding day in a mood most accounts describe as somewhere between quiet dread and a kind of desperate, clinging faith. In the evening, inside the great church of Hagia Sophia, an extraordinary scene reportedly took place. Orthodox and Catholic Christians, divided for centuries by the very church schism that had cost the city meaningful Western help, prayed together inside those walls, according to most historical accounts, for what many in that congregation sensed might genuinely be the last time. Constantine himself is said to have addressed his assembled commanders and soldiers that same night, urging them to remember exactly what it was they were defending, before taking up a position near the land walls himself, rather than remaining safely inside the palace. Mehmed launched his final assault in deliberate, carefully sequenced waves, a tactical choice historians point to as one of the more decisive pieces of battlefield judgment in the entire campaign. The first wave consisted of his least experienced and least valued troops, sent forward almost as expendable pressure, designed purely to exhaust the defenders and draw out their reserves before the real assault ever began. It failed to break through, but it drained the energy and depleted the reserves of men who had already been fighting and repairing walls continuously for nearly 2 months without any real rest. The second wave, composed of better trained Anatolian regulars, pressed harder still and came dangerously close to a genuine breakthrough at one already damaged section of wall, before being beaten back as well, at heavy cost to both sides. By the time the third and final wave came forward, Mehmed's elite Janissary Corps, the most disciplined and feared soldiers in his entire army. The defenders still holding the walls had been fighting continuously for hours on end, physically and mentally pressed right to the edge of what human endurance could sustain. It was during this final assault that 2 separate developments, occurring almost simultaneously, tipped the entire battle in a direction that, according to most historians, might otherwise have gone very differently. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had personally held the most critical stretch of the land walls for the entire 2-month siege, was severely wounded, historical accounts suggesting by a crossbow bolt or a gunshot that pierced his armor at close range. In terrible pain and bleeding heavily, he was carried away from the wall to receive treatment aboard one of the ships in the harbor. What happened in the immediate aftermath of his departure remains one of the most debated moments of the entire siege. Whether his absence caused an outright panic among the men he had commanded, or whether it simply removed the one figure capable of holding that stretch of wall together under pressure, historians still argue. But the practical effect on the battlefield was the same either way. The defense along that critical section began to collapse within minutes. At almost precisely the same moment, at a small secondary gate known as the Kerkoporta, built generations earlier into the wall for small sorties and now barely used, historical accounts describe it being left unlocked, whether through miscommunication, simple oversight, or the sheer chaos already sweeping through the defense elsewhere along the line. Ottoman soldiers discovered the open gate, and a small group pushed through it, suddenly finding themselves behind the outer defensive line entirely. It was, by every account, a genuinely small breach in purely physical terms, a handful of men through one minor gate. But it was enough. Word spread rapidly along the wall, both true and wildly exaggerated together, that the Ottomans were already inside the city in force, and the psychological collapse that followed did more damage in a matter of minutes than 2 full months of relentless cannon fire had managed to inflict. Within the chaos of that final hour, Ottoman troops began pouring through the weakened and now largely undefended points in the wall, and the organized defense of Constantinople effectively ceased to exist. What followed was the fighting of a city, not an army. Soldiers, city militia, and ordinary citizens caught between retreating toward the harbor in desperate hope of escaping by ship, or standing to fight in streets and neighborhoods they had lived their entire lives in. Constantine XI, according to most historical accounts, refused every opportunity to flee. Chroniclers describe him tearing off the imperial regalia that would have marked him out as an obvious target for capture and ransom, and choosing instead to fight and die as an ordinary soldier among his own men, rather than survive the day only to be paraded as a captured emperor. His body was never definitively identified afterward among the dead, and that lingering uncertainty gave rise almost immediately to legends among the Greek population that he had not actually died at all, but had instead been turned to stone by an angel and hidden away somewhere beneath the city, waiting for the day he would return and reclaim it. Whether or not you find comfort in that legend, The historical reality underneath it is more sobering and more human. A soldier emperor, entirely out of options, choosing in his final hour to die defending the one city he could not ultimately save. In the streets behind the collapsing wall, the fighting fractured into dozens of smaller, desperate engagements, rather than any single decisive battle. Groups of Byzantine and Genoese soldiers, cut off from clear orders and unsure how far the breach had actually spread, fought running actions from doorway to doorway and street corner to street corner, while behind them, according to most accounts, growing numbers of civilians began streaming toward the harbor in hope of reaching any ship still able to sail. Some vessels, Venetian and Genoese alike, did manage to load refugees and slip out past the chain in the surrounding chaos, saving several thousand lives in the process, even as the battle for the city itself was already effectively lost. Other civilians sought shelter inside the great churches, Hagia Sophia foremost among them, clinging to an old belief, according to several chroniclers, that an angel would descend to save the city before it could fall completely into enemy hands at the very last moment. No such intervention came, and by most accounts Ottoman soldiers reached the doors of Hagia Sophia by the afternoon, bringing that final refuge, like the walls before it, to its own quiet end. By midday on the 29th of May, organized resistance across the city had collapsed entirely, and Ottoman forces held Constantinople from wall to wall. What followed, according to most historical accounts, was a period of pillage that Mehmed had reportedly promised his troops beforehand as customary compensation for a city taken by storm rather than surrender, a grim but genuinely standard practice of that era's warfare across both Christian and Muslim armies alike, not unique to this particular conflict, though its human consequences for the ordinary people of Constantinople were devastating all the same. Thousands were killed in the chaos and violence of that first day, and thousands more were taken captive to be later ransomed or enslaved, a human cost that historians describe with real and deliberate caution, since casualty figures recorded in medieval chronicles on every side were frequently exaggerated for political or religious effect long after the fact. What is broadly agreed upon is that the violence, though comparatively brief measured against some other sieges of the era, permanently altered the population, character, and future of the city within the span of a single day. Mehmed himself reportedly entered the city later that same afternoon, and by most historical accounts, one of his first significant acts was not further destruction, but active preservation. He moved quickly to halt the ongoing plunder once he judged it had run its customary course, and rode directly to the great church of Hagia Sophia, which he ordered converted into a mosque rather than destroyed or looted for its treasures, a decision historians consistently point to as evidence that Mehmed saw himself not merely as a conqueror raising a rival capital, but as the direct political successor to the very Roman imperial tradition he had just brought to an end. A ruler intent on governing the city he had won, rather than erasing it from the map entirely. In the days and weeks that followed, Mehmed set about rebuilding what the siege and its aftermath had emptied and damaged. He actively encouraged Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Muslim settlers alike to relocate into the city, offering incentives and, according to most accounts, a considerable degree of religious tolerance for non-Muslim communities under the Ottoman system known as the Millet Framework, which allowed different religious communities a meaningful degree of self-governance under their own religious leaders. Within a generation, the population that had dwindled to around 50,000 souls during the empire's final years began climbing again, and the city, now increasingly known by variations of the name Istanbul alongside its older name, became the flourishing capital of an Ottoman empire that would go on to dominate a vast swath of territory across 3 continents for centuries to come. Not every figure from the old order survived to see that recovery. Lucas Notaras, the same powerful noble associated with resisting church union, was initially treated with apparent respect by Mehmed in the days immediately after the conquest, but was executed along with several members of his family within roughly a week of the city's fall. The precise reasons remain debated among historians, with some accounts pointing to a specific court dispute or perceived insult, and others suggesting Mehmed simply judged a figure of Notaras's rank and following too dangerous to leave alive during the fragile earliest days of Ottoman rule over a freshly conquered capital. Other surviving Byzantine nobles fared differently, some entering Ottoman service, some ransomed by relatives abroad, and some making their way into exile across Italy and the wider Mediterranean world. For the surviving Byzantine Greek world, the fall meant a genuine political ending, but not a total cultural erasure. In the years immediately surrounding the conquest, and for some years before it as tensions had already been building, a significant number of Greek scholars, philosophers, and manuscript copyists relocated westward into Italy, carrying with them classical Greek texts and centuries of accumulated learning that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries, largely untouched by the manuscript losses that had affected much of Western Europe. Many historians credit this migration of Greek scholarship as one meaningful contributing factor, among several converging causes, to the intellectual flowering of the Renaissance that was already gathering pace in Italian city-states during this same period, though historians are careful to note it was one thread among many, rather than a single decisive cause on its own. Long after the political reality of Byzantium had faded, the story of its final morning kept living on in a different form, passed down through Greek communities for centuries afterward in folk songs and oral tradition. Chief among these is the legend of the Marble King, the belief that Constantine XI did not truly die on the wall that day, but was instead carried away by an angel at the very last moment and turned to stone, hidden in a cave somewhere beneath the city, waiting in suspended sleep until the day he would wake, retake the walls, and restore the empire that fell around him. Alongside it grew another tradition, tied to the city's most sacred church, holding that on the morning the walls were breached, the priests conducting the liturgy inside Hagia Sophia did not stop even as the fighting reached the doors, but simply continued their prayers as the walls around them closed over, to be completed only on the day the city was Christian again. Historians are careful to treat both stories as folklore rather than history, expressions of grief and unresolved hope passed down across generations who had lost their capital but not their memory of it, rather than literal claims about what happened that day. But the fact that such legends took root and survived for centuries, carried by communities living under Ottoman rule who had every practical reason to move on, says something real about how deeply this single morning embedded itself in the identity of an entire people, long after the empire itself had ceased to exist on any map. It is worth sitting for a moment with what actually happened on that single day. The Roman Empire, in an unbroken if steadily shrinking form, had existed since before the birth of Christ. It had survived barbarian invasions, devastating plagues, brutal civil wars, and centuries of slow territorial decline, always finding some way to endure behind those same ancient walls. And on the 29th of May, 1453, it simply stopped existing. Historians generally treat this single date as one of the cleanest, most symbolically loaded turning points in the entire timeline of world history, for many functioning as the traditional and convenient closing marker of the medieval period itself, even though, as with most such neat historical boundaries, the actual currents of change had been building for generations beforehand and would keep moving for generations afterward. Mehmed himself would go on to rule for nearly another 3 decades after that single morning, and by most historical measures the conquest of Constantinople remained the defining achievement of a reign otherwise filled with near-constant campaigning across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the wider region. He continued personally leading armies into his later years, reportedly dying in 1481 while once again on campaign, still in the field at the head of his troops, a detail that several historians note fits the same restless, hands-on temperament that had driven him to obsess so completely over this single city 3 decades earlier. He was succeeded by his son, and the empire he had transformed from a regional Anatolian power into a Mediterranean and Balkan superpower would go on to expand still further under his descendants for generations afterward. For Mehmed, who would carry the title conqueror for the remainder of his life and reign, the fall of Constantinople was only the beginning of a far larger project. He made the city his new imperial capital, rebuilt and repopulated it steadily over the following decades, and used it as the launching point for further Ottoman expansion across the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond, for generations after his own death. His empire would go on to besiege Vienna itself within less than a century, and would remain one of the dominant powers of the wider region for roughly 400 years afterward, its final dissolution not coming until the aftermath of the First World War. What strikes most historians looking back across nearly 6 centuries is not simply that the city fell, but how narrowly and how late it very nearly might not have. A slightly larger and slightly earlier relief fleet from the west, a locked gate at the Kerkoporta that terrible night, an uninjured commander holding his critical section of wall for one more hour of fighting. Any single one of these, on its own, might plausibly have changed the outcome, at least for that particular year, and perhaps bought the crumbling empire a few more years of borrowed time. Empires this old rarely end in a single afternoon. This one did, and the margin between one more year of Roman history and the definitive end of it altogether may genuinely have come down to something as small as one door that should have been locked and was not. News of the fall reached Western Europe within weeks, carried by merchant ships and fleeing refugees, and the shock it produced was, according to most historical accounts, genuinely profound. Even among the same courts that had failed to send meaningful help, while it might still have mattered. Pope Nicholas V reportedly called for a new crusade to retake the city, and several European rulers made public pledges of support in the months that followed. But as with the pleas that had come before the siege, most of these commitments dissolved amid the ordinary rivalries and competing priorities of European politics, and no serious crusading army ever actually formed. The psychological blow, though, outlasted the political inaction. For centuries, Western European writers and clergy referenced the fall of Constantinople as a defining trauma, a moment when Christendom's eastern anchor had been lost, and Ottoman power had arrived, seemingly unstoppable, at the edge of the European mainland itself. That fear was not entirely misplaced. Within a century, Ottoman armies would besiege Vienna, deep in Central Europe, and Ottoman fleets would contest naval dominance across much of the Mediterranean. There is also a longer, more indirect thread historians trace forward from this single event, one that runs through the story of global exploration itself. With the traditional overland trade routes into Asia now passing through Ottoman-controlled territory, European merchant states face steeper costs and greater uncertainty accessing the spices, silks, and luxury goods that had long flowed through Constantinople and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Many historians point to this pressure as one meaningful factor among several converging causes that pushed Portuguese and Spanish sponsors toward funding the search for entirely new sea routes to Asia in the decades that followed, voyages that would, within a single generation, put European ships on the coasts of India and, accidentally, the Americas. It is important to be careful here, since historians differ on exactly how much weight to place on this single cause among the many economic and technological forces already pushing European exploration outward in this period. But it remains one of the more striking ways this one morning in May rippled outward across the rest of the century that followed. The city itself never stopped being a living place, even as its name and its rulers changed around it. Within a few years of the conquest, Mehmed had commissioned new mosques, covered markets, and public works across the city, layering an Ottoman capital directly over the Roman and Byzantine one that had stood there before, rather than erasing it. Hagia Sophia, converted into a mosque within hours of the conquest, would remain one for nearly 5 centuries, before a 20th century secularizing government turned it briefly into a museum, and more recently reconverted it once again for Muslim worship. A modern chapter historians note as a reminder that even a building nearly 1,500 years old can still be caught in the political currents of the present day. Walk through Istanbul today, and the same Theodosian walls that held for 1,100 years and finally gave way on that one morning in May still stand in long, broken, weathered stretches across the modern city, visible to anyone who goes looking for them, a physical seam running through the fabric of a metropolis of many millions of people, marking the exact place where one era of world history ended and another began. So here is the question worth sitting with. If you had been standing on those walls on that final night, knowing the odds stacked against you, knowing the help from the West simply was not coming in time, would you have stood beside Constantine until the very end, or slipped quietly toward the harbor, while there was still a narrow chance of escape? Tell me honestly in the comments what you genuinely think you would have done, and if you want the next story in this series, the one about what happened to the survivors afterward, and to Mehmed's rapidly expanding empire in the decades that followed this single day that changed the map of the world. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Almost everything recounted here comes down to us through a small number of eyewitness or near eyewitness sources, and it is worth understanding where this story actually comes from, since that shapes how confidently historians can state any given detail. A Venetian ship's surgeon named Niccolò Barbaro kept a day-by-day diary throughout the siege from inside the city, a source historians treat as one of the most valuable because of its immediacy, even as they note his clear anti-Genoese bias coloring some of his judgments about other defenders. A Byzantine court official named George Francis, a close confidant of Constantine himself, wrote a fuller retrospective account years after the event, offering detail on the emperor's final days that no other surviving source captures in quite the same way, though later historians have also debated how much of the material attributed to him was expanded by other writers after his death. On the Ottoman side, various court chroniclers writing in the following decades preserve details of Mehmed's planning and decision-making, though naturally with an interest in presenting the Sultan and his conquest in the most favorable possible light. Modern historians work by carefully cross-referencing these accounts against each other and against archaeological evidence from the walls themselves, weighing agreement between independent sources more heavily than any single dramatic detail appearing in only one place. It is exactly this kind of careful cross-referencing that explains why so much of this story gets told with words like most accounts suggest or historians generally agree, rather than flat, unqualified certainty. Nearly 6 centuries removed from that single morning, that careful uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is what makes it history rather than legend.